Hey there, everyone. Thanks for coming back to Racism in America, the season premiere miniseries event on #TheThing. Charles J. Bastrap here with the third part in this event, where we're going to continue to discuss the violence being ignored or downplayed by radical elements on the left and how they've begun to draw in and embolden more and more extreme right-wing groups the longer they continue, and how they erode public support that's desperately needed for this cause to survive. So please check out episodes 1.1 and 1.2 before continuing, and make sure to hit subscribe to never miss an episode. Now, violence and extremism isn't the sole purview of left-wing ideologies. Right-wing groups, especially the extreme right, have been committing violent acts in America at a far higher level for decades by far. We're talking the difference of night and day here, and there's a reason the FBI still ranks them as the greatest threat to our overall stability and security, even in the world and country where they have so many other violent groups running around. And as these protests continue to drag on past triple-digit days in some areas, it's giving these groups more ammunition, figuratively and literally. And they're trying to gear up and prepare, and they're often better armed and organized because they've been doing it a lot longer. Not to mention frequently smarter about how they conduct their operations. And they do it while many right-wing politicians and citizens call them heroes and ignore these violent impacts. Now, the same way we need to be careful not to label all people who consider themselves leftist or Antifa as actual dangers because there are many who believe in the ideas but still condemn the violence, not every counter-protester is, as the media is so fond of, far right. Again, we have these labels often misapplied. And in this particular case, it's to insulate the protesters from criticism, because if you describe all opposed with the same broad brush, it makes it easier to say who's good and who's bad. The same way right-wing sites like Fox News or Daily Wire or wherever classify all protesters as terrorists and the like to appeal to their bases and justify their own actions, because when you're writing your own stories, you get to designate the good, the bad, and the ugly, and most everyone is the hero in their own script. Now, the truth is that the news is right in the sense that the protests are mostly peaceful. However, we may mock the terminology when they say it juxtaposed to images of decidedly not peaceful scenes. And even in cities like Portland and Minneapolis, the real chaos isn't as widespread as right-leaning outlets would have you believe. They're contained to comparatively localized areas. And yes, right-wing provocateurs are indeed responsible for a lot of damage, using the chaos and cover of crowds to deflect it towards groups they oppose so that they'll get the blame. But it's also true that liberals stay in denial of their side of this and try to use facts that have no bearing on current situations to deflect from themselves, and it's having a bad effect. Saying that right-wing violence has cost more lives and carried out more violent attacks over the last X years than Antifa or BLM or any other extremists is 100% accurate. But that doesn't mean bad things aren't happening now and being perpetrated by groups on the left. Just because it's happened less historically doesn't make it any better now. I mean, would they justify keeping a handful of slaves because historically whites have kept more slaves in America? No. It's a silly argument that does what I've mentioned in other places, a twist on the Pee Wee Herman retort, this one being, I know I am, but what are you? It's a way of passively acknowledging something that you've done, but not really acknowledging how wrong it is, just to push it back and bring attention to what someone else did or is doing, as if it's a get-out-of-jail-free card. Yeah, I guess we did just burn that building and threaten all those people, but hey, the FBI says right-wing extremism is a greater overall threat. The statement's correct, but missing the point. It's an attempt to downplay one thing by presenting it as a better alternative to the other. Suppose I come up to you and I punch you in the crotch. You're not going to be happy. Now suppose someone else comes up to you and slaps you across the face. You're not going to be happy. Are you going to excuse the second person when they say, hey, look, man, I only slapped you in the face. I didn't punch you in the crotch. Does that make it suddenly not wrong, not assault and battery because it's subjectively better? Now, I've seen articles on Portland and other places, and people automatically coming, oh, I'm from Portland, that's fake news, it's all right-wing activists anyway. Look, even the New York Times, a liberal bastion of the media, is reporting these things. In an article published just recently on September 21st by Nellie Bowles, it described the situation in parts of Portland. It talks about a black veteran, Terrence Moses, observing a protest march that was being peaceful, and then several broke off and threatened his neighbor for flying an American flag, and told him that if they didn't take it down, they'd burn their house down. That's not an anti-American terrorist threat, really? Now, Moses himself, he runs a nonprofit for homeless people in Portland and served in the military and is black and in support of racial justice, and he, with some other neighbors, told them to leave the area and chased them away. Should he or his neighbors excuse these sorts of actions? that people are claiming aren't even happening because they're more likely to be, carried out by right-wing extremists? I'm more likely to be hit by a car than by lightning. That doesn't mean I wade through a pool with a lightning rod and a suit of armor during a thunderstorm. As the New York Times article states, quote, these more aggressive protests target ordinary people going about their lives, especially those who decline to demonstrate allegiance to the cause. That includes a diner in Washington who refused to raise her fist to show support for Black Lives Matter, end quote. There's a widely circulating picture of that event. Those people surrounding her are very much not right-wing provocateurs, and her refusal echoed a famous photo that's been going around, which I've been unable to ascertain is real or not, but still makes the point, of a bunch of men giving the Nazi salute with one guy having his arms down by his side. That doesn't scare you? I mean, that doesn't sound literally exactly like what Nazis and even Antifa post-World War II were doing to people, picking fights, then calling the cops to act the victims, or demanding people show allegiance or get harassed or worse. And you're defending this? Really? I mean, come on, people. The article also states that, quote, the tactics are dividing supporters of Black Lives Matter, which some worry that the confrontational approach will antagonize people who would otherwise be receptive to the message, or play into conservatives' critiques of the protests which have been largely nonviolent nationally. And they're right. It is turning people away and pumping up the far right-wing base. I can tell you right now, if I'm trying to rush my kid to a hospital in an emergency, and you're barring entrance to the hospital until I pay my tribute, you're not a protester at that point. You're a speed bump. You have the right to peaceably assemble, but you're not the only people living in this world, and it does not revolve solely around you, regardless of any real or perceived nobility. People, by and large, tune this out because, unfortunately, as much as the media tries to downplay it, they also love a good if it bleeds it leads headline, and these riots are becoming the face of the movement, and it's provably costing followers. I'm not going to be bullied or peer pressured into raising my fist or changing a profile picture. Don't come at me with silence is compliance when you're being silent about this. I don't need to prove anything, not to you or anyone else. No one does. And the fact that people are feeling pressured and scared not to do so is an indication that, you know what, maybe you're not the good guys after all, if fear is motivating not the people you're opposed to, but the people you're demanding allegiance from. Now, the article further mentions that people in Portland are actually becoming a bit more anxious as the protests are becoming more and more white. And they're seeing Antifa and Black Bloc movements, removing tables from restaurants to light on fire and handing out pamphlets with such wonderful titles as, I want to kill cops until I'm dead. I'm sure those killings will be mostly peaceful. They're not violent at all. They threaten to keep returning until demands are met. Again, not right-wing provocateurs, and really not BLM at this. This is not. Some may be saying they are, but I do not believe this to be BLM. What Lenin said, we must teach these people a lesson right now so that they will not dare even to think of any resistance for several decades. That's this philosophy at work. Heck, look up the Night of Broken Glass from Germany and see how eerily similar things are with some of these cities and what's going on. I can tell you one positive thing from all this. There are a lot of politicians, celebrities, and social media users that will undoubtedly be able to detect colon cancer at earlier stages than usual because of how far their heads are up their own asses. Proponents or apologists, for this kind of violence, they argue, well, they need to be violent because they tried to be peaceful and no one listened. When? 20 minutes before the riots on the drive over? Look, honestly, I do understand that logic because it's something that John Lewis spoke to Malcolm X about in Africa. Now, these two men couldn't have been any more different in their approaches and rhetoric, but there was a mutual respect. Happening upon one another in Africa not long before Malcolm's murder, him and Lewis had a brief meeting. And during that time, Malcolm X explained that, yeah, he's coming to a different way of thinking, but he needs to be aggressive and keep that firebrand rhetoric going because he felt it would help people like John Lewis. That if he presented a clear alternative to Lewis's pacifist tactics, the people would have no choice but to choose the less aggressive one that would ultimately lead to what both men wanted, true freedom and equality. And honestly, that's a damn good point. So I see it from that standpoint. I get why, because it's true. People, especially white people, and especially white racist people, they feared Malcolm X and the more violent black nationalist groups. But when images were shown on the news of John Lewis and his group, black and white together, peacefully marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and being beaten nearly to death by cops for it, that was a huge turning point in the civil rights movement. We remember Rosa Parks' defiant stand, or rather her defiant sit, because of how she did it and the horrible responses to it by whites. We don't remember the time she stood up, punched 3 guys in the throat, and looted the Macy's with Martin Luther King, because they didn't do that. Now, I get the argument, people saying, oh, well, stop using Dr. King as an example of nonviolence because, white people killed him anyway. What's the point? And I see that. But I also see, people quoting Malcolm X, by any means necessary, and he was killed by blacks when he started leading in that same direction. So some elements within groups just don't want to stay with the peace or care about it either way. They just want to watch the world burn. The movement itself isn't anti-cop. We've said that repeatedly. But it's hard to ignore the constant fucking kill the police chants and the signs and so many videos of people saying they want to kill cops and see them all dead, or when people rolled up to a police building in Ferguson with a dead pig that had police written on it, because no matter how fast or hard or long you spin yourself nauseated, those actions and statements are blatantly anti-cop, full stop. They don't represent the majority, and we shouldn't use them as stand-ins for it like a lot of right-wing sites like to do. But neither should we use cops genuinely bad as stand-ins for all law enforcement. It cuts both ways. But not only are the tactics of extreme elements of BLM and Antifa hurting the cause, they're emboldening the far right, which is just going to get bad. Years ago, this has got to be about 15, 16 years ago in Ohio, the KKK obtained a permit to march through a neighborhood that had been subject to a spate of gang violence by black and Hispanic individuals. Despite being human trash, they too have the right to assembly. Naturally, counter-protesters showed up. They have that right too. But while the KKK marched smugly, chanting their usual nonsense of hate, other people in the neighborhood were so angry and started fights, and they burned down a gas station and damaged storefronts. In that one afternoon, the KKK, by doing nothing but walking without raising a fist, had their job done for them, and their point proven when the reaction was violence by minorities in the minority community, exactly what they said they were marching against. They played right into their hands. That's happening now. Much has been written about the so-called Boogaloos, another loose-knit right-leaning group of varying beliefs, many of them bat crap. The New York Times and Washington Post both wrote about them and how complex they were because some parts of the movement are extreme right-wing nationalists and racists. Others want no part of that part. Others hate police and authority and the government overstep more than anything racial. And then there's others who just want to keep the peace to the Second Amendment, fire off their guns whenever they want to. Like Antifa, it's impossible to group them all into one neat little box. And we actually saw members of Antifa and the Boogaloos standing side by side protecting storefronts and assisting rioters and protesters that were injured by police responses or by their own tactics. But there are darker elements within them that do want to infiltrate these peaceful protests to cause chaos and further turn people against them. And they need to be addressed, punished, and stopped because it's worked and it's working. There have been several arrests in cities where there was violence originally attributed to Black Lives Matter, but that turned out to be the work of right-wingers, like the neo-fascist Proud Boys hate group, a bunch of male-only racists that try to act like they're only just misunderstood, but are walking and often dangerously armed human dumpster fires. Sometimes that point about most damage and violence being done by right-wing groups was oversold. In the immediate days of the Minneapolis riots, blame was thrown at out-of-state people and right-wing groups, but of those arrested, according to documents obtained by the press, over 85% were in-state residents, and there were less than 5 people in total that they could find any ties to any right-wing anything anywhere. But that hasn't been the case everywhere. In Richmond and Kansas City, violence erupted once right-wing groups showed up to the scene to instigate. A similar tactic failed earlier in Richmond because of before all this started, because there was a group headed to the Capitol to exercise Second Amendment rights, and the media braced everyone for this horrific event that wound up actually having no violence and the group cleaning up after themselves in ways that were better than a lot of these other movements have done. But at one point, a group of neo-Nazis did show up and try to incite things, and protesters and counter-protesters kind of joined together and shouted them away. But these tactics aren't always successful, because we're seeing evidence of right-wing associated terrorist cells and terrorist plans being thankfully foiled by local police and the FBI. We're seeing evidence of them trying to sabotage peaceful demonstrations by dressing like BLM supporters and carrying out violent acts. We've seen Trump supporters doing things like this, and they aren't always, contrary to popular belief, far-right or even racist. They just want to do whatever they think will help Trump win re-election. and they become emboldened when Trump doesn't address them or call them out, when he's as in denial over the threat of right-wing extremism and the effects of his rhetoric on them as the left is on their part. Trump will be the first to tweet about a Black Lives Matter act that's violent, even something that's not actually them, but rather footage from unrelated events from years ago, as he's done a few times, but then won't say a word about his own supporters doing the same, or attempt to distance himself from them as one should. I guarantee if someone did something like what we're seeing now in the names of Presidents Bush or Obama, those men would have shut that down right quick. We've seen some instances already of outside groups supplying weapons to peaceful protesters, as was caught on camera for a march on the Brooklyn Bridge that resulted in multiple injuries when instigators infiltrated on both sides. So, we have rumors and conspiracies of George Soros secretly controlling all the Black Lives Matter protests being peddled by right-wing conspiratorial types, leading to further unrest as they start organizing these things on Facebook and these counterattacks against imaginary enemies to play the heroes. This is a dangerous game that both sides are playing here. We are heading towards an especially contentious presidential election in just a couple of weeks, and given the Democrats pushing for mail-in votes, knowing the massive delay it'll likely cause, and that left-wing groups and even celebrities have openly or subtly called for violence if anything but Biden winning is the outcome, and Trump is doing whatever he can to make it harder for the USPS to do their job so that he can play out a self-fulfilling prophecy when they can't tally things in time, we are up against a very real possibility where Trump is declared the winner on election night, and then elements of the left riot and protests like they did in 2016, and in a week or so afterwards, the mail-in votes get counted, and we learn that Biden actually won, at which point I expect the same behavior from elements of Trump supporters on the right. And Trump is, not surprisingly, he's not being helpful in already calling the election illegitimate because of the mail-in ballots, and refusing to openly commit to a peaceful transfer of power should he lose unless the Supreme Court intervenes, which is only further inflaming the far-right elements. It's like both parties are intentionally doing things to try and incite a war. Now, I don't want to get into voting right now because that's going to be covered in a future episode. But for now, it needs to be looked at from the framework of the present, and how much more can and how much more will the American public take in the year of economic disaster, close to 250,000 dead from a disease that a not insignificant part of the population still thinks is an imaginary hoax, and racial unrest. Every event becomes a potential powder keg. In Kenosha, we had a white teen with a gun shoot 3 protesters, killing 2, during demonstrations after Jacob Blake. He'd gone to the city to protect businesses that were previously attacked. At some point, he was confronted by a man and chased. Joseph Rosenbaum, the man in question, grabbed for his gun. Rittenhouse fired. Now, given the violence around the city after Jacob Blake's shooting, and that this guy literally tried to grab his gun and threatened him and attacked him first, can you really say this kid didn't have cause to defend himself? After that, a larger group caught up and chased after him, and someone fired a shot in the air towards him as he ran away. At one point, he tripped and protesters took swings at him. One attempted to strike him with a skateboard and then grabbed his gun. He was also killed. And this was after Rittenhouse had fired shots at the ground to warn him to keep back. A third individual armed with a gun at first seemed like he was going to surrender, but then started taking a step forward. He was shot in the arm. Rittenhouse went away. Immediately after, turned himself into the police. And immediately after that, both sides went into spin mode. Now, to those opposed, he was going to get off on white privilege and get away with murder, and he was in violation of a gun law in the state of Wisconsin and never should have been there in the first place because it wasn't his store. On the other hand, neither should the people who have been attacking the businesses in that area that had confronted him first. On Rittenhouse's side, even the New York Times refuted the idea that he went there just to pick fights despite him being armed, because they have video of him helping protesters and police alike, tending to injuries, giving water, and other very non-picking a fight behaviors, offering people saying, hey, I have a med kit, are you hurt, I'll come help you. It didn't matter what side they were on. But he was chased by a mob of people, in which one of the survivors that was shot was armed and told a friend at the hospital he regretted not blowing him away. So they weren't after him to give hugs. They were even shouting that they were going to beat his ass, among other things. Now, should he have been there? No. Was he in possession of a firearm that he was not legally allowed to carry at his age, in the state of Wisconsin? Yeah. He may have had some good intentions, but he went into a situation above his pay grade, though unlike George Zimmerman, he didn't initiate the combative contact. But that's been one of the bigger arguments I've seen, that he shouldn't have been there. And him getting chased by protesters, well, even though he was almost assaulted or worse, it's his own fault. He deserved it. He shouldn't have been there. He broke the law. Let's put another scenario out there. Underage girl, fake ID, sneaks out of her house, goes to a bar, gets wasted. Well, she shouldn't have been there. She's broken multiple laws. Does she deserve to be manhandled or worse by some patrons? Is that where we're at? You shouldn't have been there, therefore you deserve violence towards you? No. Despite the media's attempt to call him a mass murderer, as Facebook flagged him as, or a right-wing provocateur, witness accounts and an examination of multiple CCTV cameras by the New York Times painted a different picture, as did recently more complete footage compiled from other witnesses that showed Rittenhouse being chased and confronted first. There's no doubt he was misguided and shouldn't have been there. But that's also not enough cause to be threatened with harm and chased. And yeah, when you're outnumbered and one of the people doing the chases is likewise armed, you better believe he had the right to defend himself. This isn't Han Solo shooting first and Mos Eisley. Alright, as usual, both sides try to simplify and deflect. He does need to serve justice. He needs some sort of punitive issuance because even in defense, he did kill people while in possession of a weapon that he willfully had possession of in violation of the law, so at the very least a weapons charge needs to be applied, maybe trespassing. But there's also something to be said that, all three people he shot had criminal records, including some pretty bad ones. So a lawyer could argue they were a violent bunch just on that. They were. And on the words of the survivor to his friends, but honestly, Rittenhouse couldn't have known that, and his actions weren't based on foreknowledge, but rather an anger group coming up on him and refusing to stop at the moment. Now, those who think he was wrong, what do you think they were going to do to him after they caught him? Do you really think they were just going to let him on his way? Because he tried to run away. They followed. He tried to shoot at the ground to force them away. They kept coming. As for whether his shots were justified, well, according to Chapter 939.48 of Wisconsin's self-defense law, it's pretty crystal clear. An individual has the right to use a force which is intended or likely to cause death or great bodily harm if they reasonably believe that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to themselves. If this isn't justified self-defense, nothing is. At least 2 people had already tried to grab his gun, another was armed, several tried to physically assault him in other ways. You still think it's not justified? Regardless of him breaking the law by possessing the gun, that doesn't supersede his other rights, and it's hard to paint the group of individuals who are all breaking the law in the first place in rioting and assault and battery with the intent quite possibly to kill and also armed illegally as the shining knights here. At the same time, Rittenhouse being hailed as a hero and akin to the revolutionaries who fired the first shots at Lexington and Concord is likewise wrong. As much as he did not go there and seek to do violence, he did put himself into a situation that easily could have escalated even more, and treating it as no big deal just because he killed 3 of the enemy, despite it being in defense, that will quite possibly encourage others to imitate and emulate, and likely with more antagonistic tactics. Not long after, a guy was killed in Portland by a left-wing protester. He was a Trump supporter and part of a right-wing group that does have some members that lean much further to the right towards extremist-type views, but there was no indication that he himself was an extremist. His crime that night was getting into a verbal altercation with the individual, stemming from different factions of the 2 groups, using paintballs and bear sprays to varying degrees against one another, like fucking children. But witnesses say it all happened so fast. 1 second they were yelling at each other, the next second the guy was dead. Now, I didn't see the same people on Facebook crying about Rittenhouse posting about that story, other than to parrot he was a right-wing extremist that, deserved it, and to lay all the blame on Trump for these riots. And amazingly, the more we saw of these situations going on, and the more we saw, Trump going to actually some of these sites and, surveying some of the damage, suddenly we got the Schrodinger's riots. They were both imaginary, but one real Trump's wall. And no blame at all at the local governments who let it go on for around 100 days at that point without charging people or holding them accountable for their crimes. I don't even know how to stretch for those sorts of mental gymnastics. I don't. Extremists on both sides are doing what they do best, or worse, depending on your perspective. They're making it about them. They're distracting from a worthy and important cause, that of continued racial injustice, by committing acts of war and terrorism through our streets. It doesn't matter that they're mostly peaceful, even 97% so, as some media outlets have stated. Less than a single percentage point. That's how many blacks are wrongly killed by cops compared to how many encounters there are with them. a fraction of a single percent. And we're angry about that, and we should be. We want that to stop, and we should, because it should. But then don't tell me 3% of violence is acceptable and we shouldn't address it. Don't tell me that we should allow it because people are angry and wonder why screaming burn it all down is somehow having negative side effects. And President Trump, instead of instigating, instead of threatening, be a leader. You took the time to tweet about your supporter killed in Portland, but no time to talk about the innocent blacks killed wrongly by police, other than to talk about the violent parts of the riots. So yeah, you know what? You actually do bear some burden, because you showed for 4 years an unwillingness to act like an adult and a leader. And I know part of that is people like Pelosi and others who would let themselves dehydrate if you said water was good for you just out of spite. But the antagonism, the arrogance, the attempts at miscarriages of justice, successful or not, that hasn't helped. They were never going to like you. They'd made up their minds the second you did the unthinkable and beat Hillary. But you had the chance to prove them wrong. You blew it, and you continue to do so. So yeah, a lion's share of the blame in places like Portland, that must fall on the local and state government's unwillingness to act. But you could have been the bigger person and offered an olive branch. Instead, you were too busy going on Twitter tantrums, denying COVID-19 realities, making threats to send in the military, and holding rallies and focusing more on re-election. But now all of this said about these violence in these groups, what's there to do? Well, we're at the point I alluded to, coming up with solutions, and I really do hope you've stayed with me through this long odyssey and realized why I had to say as much as I did before getting here. Because here's where things are going to circle back more on one another, as we try to take some good from the bad and move forward outside of slogans and provably disastrous policy proposals. The first solutions I'm going to talk about and address in the next video are ones that we can do as ordinary citizens, and even with celebrities and athletes. And that's going to be followed later by the final part of this particular miniseries event, what police and law enforcement and government and media can and should do as I wrap this all up. So stay with me, folks. We're getting there. These next two are big, but we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I'll see you in the next video. #TheThing, episode 1.4, Racism in America, how we can start turning things around, coming tomorrow afternoon. So please make sure you're subscribed, and thanks for tuning in. Be well.